Evening, everybody. We will try this with microphone. We have Zoom going. I'm not 100% sure how this will work with masks and the audio at home because we need to project our voice for everybody here, but welcome. We are here tonight for kind of a first community kickoff meeting of what will be one of the most exciting projects that Saco will have had for their school department, probably since the last time you built a school. And I'm not quite sure when that was, but we have the opportunity here in Saco to set the course for what our educational system and buildings will look like for the next 40 plus years. And we're provided this great opportunity, as you guys will all remember, back in 2017-ish, Saco applied for what would be a state-approved construction project and was placed number four on the list, I believe. Right. And that is a super high ranking. So to give you a little bit of history before I turn it over to our friends here from Oak Point. Oak Point Associates is the architect that has been selected by the community in the school committee to represent us. And after we make a lot of local decisions, they will take some of those local decisions and help us turn it into a vision for what a new building will look like. So just a little bit about the process of where we are right now is that 2017 application approved. Fast forward to November 4th, 2020. So almost a year ago, the State Board of Education moved you on to the approved list, which meant you could begin the process. Certainly, we all know that last year was a challenging year for every school department in the nation. And this summer, we were able to officially kind of start that project with the state. At this point in time, we have had 3 visits with the Maine Department of Education to talk about the building. We have selected a building committee from the school committee. We have had 4 site inventory committees. And a site inventory committee is a group of individuals who just working to look at all the possible plots of land that might work for a building in Saco. And we know that with land in Saco at this point in time, that something could be added to that list and that could be gone in a week. So we have a very robust list of all of the possible sites that if you got a handout or you saw around the agenda, and we'll talk about it a little bit more tonight, is that we have a draft site matrix kind of scoring system, because what we want to do is make sure that as a community, we don't lock in on one set plan, and that we look at all alternatives that meet the state guidelines, which Oak Point will talk about tonight, and that we provide a clear rating system of what we think may be one of the best sites for a future school, whatever that is. So we've had 4 of those meetings to talk about getting that inventory built up. In addition, we've just started what is called program committee. And the program committee is a group of individuals from the community that their task is to add around all of the ideas of what we want for a school and what can happen, meaning grade levels, replacements. And the task of that committee will be to provide options for the community, clear options of what could be built, and at the same time, making it crystal clear about if we make this decision, these will be the other challenges that could still exist for Saco. So we want to make sure that in anything that we do, we can tell the community, here's what we think is a good solution or one of the solutions, and here are all the other things that you must consider if you make that choice. Because at the end of this, in 5 or 6 years, we'll have the opportunity to walk into a brand new building, hopefully, that we will all be very, very pleased with. but we also want to make sure that we know about all of the things that you still have to deal with as a community and have those on the table so that people can recognize that there probably will still be some challenges with buildings here, as we have several buildings that need some attention. Throughout the night, there is going to be opportunities for you to ask questions. And I think one of the pieces that I want to do, whether you're at home watching on Zoom, if you have a question, just use your raise hand feature and we'll promote you to a panelist and allow you to ask a question. Or if you're here in the audience, just raise your hand and let's have a conversation so that we can help everybody learn by asking really good questions. So before I hand it over to Oak Point, I would just want to pause for a second and say, okay, so we have a little bit of the history here and where we are and what we're doing. Does anybody have a question about that piece? Perfect. So, no, Rob, you're not allowed to ask a question. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Oak Point. I'm going to see if this mic seems like it gives me a little bit of feedback when I move out of range. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Rob.
Thank you. It might be the microphone that's over here. So tonight, I'm Rob Tillotson. I'm always Rob Tillotson, but tonight I'm still Rob Tillotson. I'm president of Oak Point Associates. I'm an architect and an engineer. And the team here specializes in school projects. Allison Tabby Mateo is our landscape architect in charge of the site. Norman Lemire is the project coordinator. Sarah Smith is the educational planner and space planner. And the fellow over there is a new guy. He's been with the firm for like 15 years, but maybe still call him a new guy. Jonah DeWaters. I don't know if dirty look, Sarah. I just turned off. Okay, so we've put together a presentation.
It's finicky, Rob.
Finicky, okay.
I think if you stand right there, I know it works.
Okay.
But you can only face frontwards the whole time, or it won't work either.
But then I can't see what's going on.
Yeah.
So, all right, so Jeremy just mentioned what we're going to be talking about tonight. The most important thing to discuss this evening is that this is the first part of a very long process. Jeremy said 5 or 6 years. It could be a little bit less, but unlikely. You have to go through a whole process of site selection and programming, decide what you're going to build and negotiate with the state. And it just takes a long time to do all that and find, design it, construct it. This is the state's 21-step process. And we're not going to bother blowing it up. It's just as hard to read when it's right in front of you. I know you guys have a copy of it. We put it in a slightly better. This is basically a condensed version, focusing on the really important parts. We're going to go through the process of site approval. The application has been done. We're already at the. We've been selected. You selected us. They've selected you for a project. We're working on a regional and new first renovation analysis. Basically, the first thing we have to do is look at all of your schools and evaluate to make sure that whatever choice we collectively make going forward is the right choice. You were selected to replace Young School, but the state school project process, when you get to this point, it just means you have a school project. They expect you to analyze everything that's going on in the community and decide, help you decide whether the Young School replacement as is, where it is, makes sense, or do we look at the possibility of doing some other type of school, size school, location of school. But through this process, you may decide to do a pre-K to 5 school. You might do a 1 to 3 school. You may do something that takes care of the needs of Young School and the needs of Saco going forward. So we've done projects there. where we actually just replaced the school that was on the list of those projects where we replaced the school that was where it was, but it added other grades to it. We're done a completely different school, the one that was supposed to be there. We didn't leave it alone, but we chose not collectively to do anything with that school. At the end of the site review process, there'll be a straw vote. All it means is we'll come back together, and after the process, you'll all hold up your hands and go, so we support this or you don't support this. That just shows the state that there is at least the support of the people in the room for the project. In order to decide on what site it's going to be, we need to figure out through the process what's going to go there. Are we just going to replace it in school? Are we going to do an expanded school program, or what exactly is it that Saco really would like to have and what they would really need to have? So part of the site approval is analyzing again, the facilities you have and deciding as a community what we'd like to ask the state to help us with. And is it a bigger school? Is it the same school? But that's what this night starts with. This is just information. So do you want to talk about the sites, Allison?
I think we've got a few more things before we get to that.
Okay. So this is where where your schools are. The pre-K program is that way. We have Fairfield, Burns School, both of which were on the state list, but way down the list. Burns School was relatively high, and Fairfield was way down the list. So in order to get money for those programs, you'd be waiting a very long time for at least Fairfield. And Young School, you know all about that, and then the middle school. And again, we're going to be reviewing all those buildings, what they're going to need in the future from a capital improvement standpoint, what the energy usages are, and all of that. Just try to analyze which way to go.
I'm just gonna sit and speak.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Try.
It's finicky.
I'll see if it'll work. So as Rob mentioned, what we do is we go into these different buildings and do an analysis of each of them. We won't be doing Young School, obviously, because that's not one that we're going to want to keep, but definitely Fairfield and Burns, going through the entire building, seeing what spaces are in there, and what they have for populations and things like that. One of the other points that's really important in this process is community engagement. So what happens throughout the process is we have a number of community public forums and charrettes. So this is the first public forum. This is more of an information kind of giving you the process and what's happening. And then throughout the process, we'll have more public forums that go back and forth and gather information of how the community feels about the process. You can see it as a very transparent process of what we're doing. We'll report out to you what's happening. When we start getting into plans, we'll have comments on that, which direction should we go, things like that. So it's a very open community process. And that is the way that you get the best outcome for people, you know, in agreement with what they want for the city. The other thing that we do is go in and talk to all of the staff, students, all of the administration, things like that, of all the buildings that you're in, what's working, what's not working in this space, both the building itself and also academically. Another thing that we do is all of the things that we do have to be presented to the school board. So decisions that are made for all of the, which way we go for organization, the site, all of that has to be approved by the school board. So those are other conversations that we have. So again, just keeping the process very transparent. So this is an example of what we have to do for all of the programs. On the left-hand side, you'll see a program matrix. And what that does, we start with what you have. So we do an inventory of all the spaces that you have, how much square footage that is, how many students are in that space. And then on the right-hand side here, there's a matrix that's put together. It's the state design guide. And they are very prescriptive on what you're allowed to have for your school design. So for example, a kindergarten classroom is defined as 1,000 square feet. A standard classroom is 800 square feet. So they kind of give you a definition of what all of the spaces should be. So we take those numbers and compare that to what you have existing within your buildings and kind of come up with what the space will need to be for the new building, depending on what the organization will be. If it stays as a K1 or K3, we can get an idea of how big that building is going to need to be, and that will reflect back to what we do for the site. So whenever we start to go through all of this, all of the information that we gather kind of leads to the next step. And getting this information and what the program committee will be doing will lead to kind of, pushing where we go with the next step of the site.
Thanks, Sarah. So as far as the site goes, Jeremy talked a little bit about where we're at. There's a site inventory committee that's currently meeting, and where we start with the site selection process is really looking from 50,000 foot view down at the city. What we're doing right now is we're doing a lot of data collection just broadly on a number of different factors that contribute to what makes for a good school site. On the left is a matrix that's being developed, and Jeremy's going to go through that in more detail in a little bit in the presentation. But what that is it's a list of criteria. We start with criteria that's important to the state. So when we do our site selection application, the DOE asks very specific questions that they would like to know about the site that we eventually move forward with, what it has for utility capacity, what it has for environmental considerations, how big it is, potential for expansion, how close it is to to the city center, how well it works with a comprehensive plan, that type of thing. So we start with those types of elements. We've met in the site inventory committee and have asked, what other things are important to the citizens in Saco? What makes for a good school? What are you particularly important? What do you particularly feel is important? What should we prioritize? So that list gets tweaked, and this matrix is a way that we can kind of start with what's important before we really narrow in on what the site should be. It's a way that we end up being able to compare a number of different sites at sort of that 50,000 foot view without narrowing in too quickly on any given site. So on the right hand side of the slide are just some images of some of the current GIS mapping that we're doing. So GIS is Geographic Information Systems, and that's a way that we can overlay different things, different levels of data about zoning, about where wetlands are in the city, about where parcels are of a certain size that we might be interested in, where students are located, where student concentrations, places, neighborhoods where there are a lot of students. So we can kind of start to understand that bigger picture. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. And then the next step is really, and it's working in tandem, at the same time, like Jeremy said, we're sort of out there sort of starting to research what properties might be out there that people are interested in selling, what properties are already for sale, what properties might people be interested in learning more about having, if they have a piece of land that they might be interested in selling. That's one piece that the site inventory committee is really looking at. And then that piece that Sarah and Rob talked about with the programming. We don't yet know what the school is going to be, but we can do a lot of work on site selection without knowing that, because we're really looking at it at that sort of bigger level. Once we get some of those things figured out, that's when we start sort of using that matrix to narrow down and have those things come together to a shorter list of sites. And at that point, we start walking the sites. We might do environmental scans, some initial deed research, some looks into things like wetlands or vernal pools. And eventually, when we narrow it down to a few sites, we'll start actually kind of laying out some school facilities on it to see how well it really fits. And at the end of the day, after all of that, and there, like Sarah said, there are several public forums that happen within that time frame for input. We end up eventually with a site that is being recommended with the school program that the community decides is what they really feel is the best fit. And really, that's when we start to to do plans like this, where we're starting to really talk about bubble diagrams, or how, like I said, how the facilities might lay out, to be able to really test, kind of kick the tires on the site a little bit further.
Oh, it was?
You would.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we kind of jumped the gun a little bit on the first part, but we're on the site selection. And in order to really choose what site is appropriate after going through all this process, we really need to know what the school is going to be. And that's what the program committee is working on now. And again, the state doesn't have a fixed amount of money or a fixed project when you get approved. So it's not like there's a leprechaun guarding a bag of gold, but basically the state will fund whatever is appropriate that follows their guidelines going forward. So it could be, again, exactly the same size school you have where it is, but they like to make sure they're handling the best solution for the community. So it might include something to do with the students that are here or in Fairfield or even in the middle school. So we're evaluating all those pieces. So the size of the school site the state approves is 20 acres plus 1 acre per 100 students. So if it's a 300 student school, it's 23 acres. And if it's more than that, it goes up somewhat, but it's usable acres. I want to make sure that everything that you need on the site is going to fit. So as we go forward after the site approval, we go to concept, and that's when we start putting the what's it?
I think just switch the slides.
Yeah, what's this? Okay.
Rob,
Yes.
can we just pause,
Please. Yeah.
pause for a second? So I want to make sure that everybody is really clear what Rob just said about budget. At this point in time, the state has not said, you get $20 million. That's not what they say. What they say is come to us with a proposal of what you think is the best option for your city and your school department. And you start there. So you may come with an idea. One idea could be $30 million. However, there could be another idea that we think is best for the city that's $50 million. And you're going to negotiate with the state about what you feel is the best vision and selection for your children of Saco for future use. So I think that's one of the pieces that sometimes people say, well, are you working on a budget? Not yet. Once we get to a point where there is a concept and we're thinking about going out to bond, there then will be a clear budget. After the state has said, yes, that's what you have convinced everybody that this is what Saco needs.
Right, that's absolutely true. So basically you're coming up with a solution and then determining how much that solution is going to cost. And then the solution is going to be subject to review by the state, and clearly by you folks too, and the budget as well. So there's a sense as we go forward what it's going to be, but it's very, very important. And one of the common misconceptions is they've said, okay, you're going to get this school, it's going to be $15 million. It's not really not the case. So you have to wait to find out what you really want. And the state, as we found, is very supportive of the right solutions.
So this brings us to the concept approval portion of the project. So once you have all those, I'm not mic'd. Hello.
There you go.
So once you have all those ideas conceptualized, we know how big the building's going to be, how many students are going in it, where the site's going to be, and we start developing. If I stand over here. As Jeremy said, that's when we start developing the budget for this building. We know how many rooms are going to be in the building, how many students are going to be there, and we start organizing it and figuring out all the details within this building. So we develop a budget that will be going to referendum. We, not just the construction cost of the building, but administrative costs, design costs, fees and services. We include contingencies that might come up during construction. And once all that's done, that's when we can present it to the people of Saco to vote for this building to pass forward, and the state will give us approval to move forward and into the construction. I think this is where we want to show you some examples of some state-funded projects. This is a walkthrough of one of our buildings. This is what you can expect to see once we get further along in the design. Rob can further describe, because he knows a lot more about this building.
Sorry, so this one is not a state-funded project. It's a great project, but it's for Camden Rockport Middle School. They didn't rise to the level of need that you folks did. But this is to show what you're going to be able to see when we move forward after we decide what the concept is going to be. You'll have a sense of what the business looks like. Again, this is the middle school, this locally funded. It's unlikely that Jeremy is going to push real hard for an auditorium that an elementary school typically does not get an auditorium. It's just, however,
we feel like there's an argument to be made.
we're gonna back him up all the way. But anyways, you get a sense of what the school's gonna look like. You can, I think, you go through it, Sarah. Thank you. And then the major milestone that comes up after this. So at the concept approval stage, you'll have a chance to again in a straw poll to make sure that we're doing the right school, and that the city supports the efforts of your subcommittees and your administration and us, and what the state is allowing us to move forward and supporting it moving forward. One thing I want to mention, when we develop the budget, it is for the building. It handles fees and all of that. Takes care of the site costs, developmentally, as well as the purchase price. And it includes technology for the building. It includes furnishings for the building. So it's a lot more than just see here. It's all hopefully nicer chairs in the new building, but all those things as well. So I'm sorry,
Rob, you talked about site costs.
yes.
Is that something that, I think that's an important piece that we learn a little bit about here right now?
Yep.
And I'd want to clarify that question out there, that we've touched on it a couple of times here, but as you think about site cost, site selection, communities have a couple of different options. One, we will inventory all of the land that is currently owned by the city. Now, some of that land that we would sift through may have some restrictions on it that have to be dealt with. If the city has land, that's yours. The state will not buy your land from you. If we have to go out and there is a site that we say, that's the perfect site. First of all, it has to be, as Rob talked about, they're really looking for 20 acres plus 1 acre per 100 students of usable land. And let's say that Saco finds a piece that is 40 acres and it's the most beautiful piece of land, and we, as a community, someone says that's where it should be. In that scenario, the state would pay for the amount that's needed, 20 usable acres plus 1 acre per 100 students. You would have 2 appraisals done, and they would support the average price of the appraisal. So in a scenario where, say there was a piece of property that was 1.5 million and the state's or for sale for 1.5 million, and the state appraisals came back at 1.2, the municipality could be on the hook for the difference.
Yes. The other thing that happens with that is, and this is an example we did just a few years ago, the property that we found, which happened to be next to the existing high school, was available, but it would only sell 40, we only needed 25. So the state paid for the 25, and the town was fortunate enough to buy the additional acreage, because how often do you get decent land right next to your school for future growth? So there are some benefits to buying additional land if it's the only way you can do it, or to spending the additional money if it's the most appropriate way to go. But again, they follow very tightly with their appraisals and the averages of the two. So once you get through concept approval, then but by that point, we will have done a lot of public forums and all decided what the school was going to be and where it was going to be. And then we get to actually design the building and forward with that. And the design and funding approval, once you cross that line, which is right after concept approval, then everything that you've paid before that, consultants, us, appraisal fees, that sort of thing, gets reimbursed. You get reimbursed from the state. So moving forward, all the expenses associated with it will be paid. And then the biggest part from our standpoint is the construction design. And then that starts getting paid for by the state through the city. And then once the construction happens, they take care of that as well. There's some interesting ways and times that the funding has to happen, and you have to do bond and anticipation note to get to a certain point, and then you borrow the money to do the entire school. And again, if we follow the state guidelines, which in some cases we've done projects where it was just state guidelines. We've done some projects where it was important for a community to have more sustainability things added to the project, or additional square footage for one thing or another, or a bigger gym, because an elementary size gym is pretty small. And all those things are based on how many kids are in the school as well. So if you do a small elementary for a couple of grades, you're gonna get probably a gym about this size, maybe a little bit smaller. But if you're building a school, it might make sense to have for the community another gym, so that you can do all sorts of functions after school as well. So they do support. You're doing that with the project, but it's important to note that they don't support it financially. Just talk about that part. Okay, so that was the final funding approval. You want to talk about that, Norm?
So after the design and funding approval, one thing that wasn't mentioned is what we go through the design process, we come up with a construction document, and we have checkpoints along the way. We need to make sure that we stay within budget. So we'll tweak the design to make sure that happens. And once we get design and funding approval from the state Department of Education, we can go out to bid. So the final funding approval is after the bids come in. We establish that the contractors that we've selected to allow to bid the project, we select the low bid that comes in, that's by state guidelines, and work through all the detailed line items within the budget to make sure that we're still on target. We change the estimated construction value to the actual bid value. We can use a contingency that we have for the bid process. We usually carry 5% for that in case there's some anomalies in the bid climate at that time. We also identify anything else that we've estimated along the way for any surveys or anything like that, what the actual numbers were for those prices. And then we keep a percentage for construction contingencies for anything that happens along the way, for change orders and things like that. We also have money set aside for things like a clerk of the works, who will be the eyes and ears of the designer during construction, who's on site every day, reports to us. And now we have, these are actually the state funded project.
Thanks, Norm, sorry.
Thanks. So I'm just going to breeze through these really quickly. This is an example of a state-funded school that we did for Portland. It is the Amanda Rose School. This is a K-5, actually pre-K to 5. So this is the site, front side of the building. This is a tree that we actually redesigned the school around to save this tree because it was important for the community. So really taking into account what matters to a community when we're designing a space. We didn't even know how important this tree was until somebody mentioned it after the fact when we had the building designed. So we had to tweak our building to save this tree. So just showing our commitment to our communities. Here's an example of the main entrance with the percent for art piece, which is all of the floating fish up above. Again, another part that's included in the state process. Here's their cafeteria space, and this was a pre-K to 5, so at that level, the state supports a platform stage area for performance. And you can see those panels in the back that opens up onto the gym side so that they can have performances on either side depending on the size of the group. So this is sort of a typical state-funded project for finishes and sizes. This was a school that was a little bit over 500 students. This is a classroom shot that shows, you kind of look in here, there's a movable wall. They had a lot of team teaching at this school. So we had a lot of movable walls that were able to open up 2 grades at once for their program. So that's another thing with the state that you talk to them about what your programming is, how you're set up educationally, and then we design the school based around that pedagogy of how you're teaching. So for this instance, they had a lot of team teaching that we accommodated. And then this is just an example of what's pretty common now in newer schools where you have sort of an open shared space that's used for, here, this furniture is movable and you can set it up for those stages. We can have students come out here outside. If you can see on the left and the right, there's glass here that can be monitored from the classroom. A teacher can send students out to that area to work. A specialist can work with a child in that space. We also have small group spaces, things like that. So these are just examples of different spaces that the state supports in a state-funded building.
And just to let you know that we didn't. So stepping back a little bit on the tree. So we got through the whole initial concept stage and met with tons of people from the city and tons of people from the community, and we did a concept which everybody was really in tune with. And then we were at a meeting just before we went to concept approval, and somebody said, "It's just too bad about that tree." I said, "What tree?" It was a beautiful tree, but then it was planted for somebody. It was nurtured for years and years because it was a very important thing. So I asked the staff to go back, and all of us huddled about the next day and came up with a new concept that saved the tree, and it really saved the project. I mean, it was really great place. The kids wait for their parents there. It's just really in tune with the community. I just wish that person had been in an earlier meeting. But,
So we're gonna turn over.
yeah, we're gonna turn to that little story behind this. Jeremy's next.
Okay, all of you who got an opportunity to pick up a matrix here tonight, and anyone who's at home, if you click on the agenda link, you will be on the site matrix. It should be linked there. And one of the pieces that we are trying to work through, this is where we would love to get any feedback, is that as you start looking at sites, there are a lot of different factors that can complicate that selection and making sure that you make the right choice. And I suspect that everybody in the room who has children or lives in a certain area or there's just really a lot of feelings about this. And so we tried to go through an example that has been used in other school districts that has been, looked at and seen by the DOE, and trying to think about what are those first, and it's kind of in gold on this one, what are those first wave things that you say, okay, this is what's really important to me, and that may be different than what's important to somebody else. And so we know that as we look at selection, one of the biggest pieces is that the site has to be the appropriate size. Meaning we can't build on 5 acres. It probably is just not going to work. And while there may be that site in town that is a beautiful 5 acres, that's just not what the state is going to recommend. So we said, okay, let's find a site that's the right size. That seems like an important piece for us. It also seems very important to us as a group that the consideration of having public utilities of sewer, water, and 3-phase power are things that the Department of Education and their construction team really wants to see. Now, does that mean that there are places that are built on wells and with septic systems? Yes, of course, because we know parts of the state don't have public utilities, but that makes things much more difficult in the construction process. Certainly for Saco, another major concern that we will hear as a group, and certainly as superintendent of schools, I hear that concern around buses, but traffic. Making sure we find a place that can handle whether this is 300 students or over 1,000 students. Those are very different decisions that have to be made. So as we go through the programming committee, we have to be thinking about the number of students. How many cars will that bring? Is this in a location that doesn't add major minutes to bus rides? Because if it's in a location that adds for one part of town, if it's in a location where it adds 20 minutes for one side of town, we may see more parents choose to drop off their kids, which could then add to some of the traffic frustrations. So as the superintendent, I'm gonna have to stand here. I'm just. Okay. All right, let's see. So if I'm a parent and I know that my kid's gonna now be on a bus for an hour, I may make a different decision. One of the other pieces that's really important to us in this is not only traffic flow, but when we look at our population of students, which we will lay out, from our view here, we'll need to be able to say, okay, bus rides are about the same. Can it be, because of the location, can it be handled by the current busing fleet? Or does it require, because of length of distance, 4 or 5 additional buses and drivers that would have to be part of the budget process? So that transportation aspect is very important. Also, I think as we went through this list, we looked at no known environmental restrictions as being a major piece. No known easements or development restrictions. We have some situations where we know that as national
Land and water conservation.
National land and water conservation pieces that kind of create some challenges that we'll have to work around. That the site that's selected, that putting a large school would make a lot of sense because it's compatible with what's around it and other use.
And so those are, as we met as a group the other day, and we were saying, okay, how do you get that first flush of, there's a lot of factors on here to start looking at saying, how do you say a site, say, hey, that one's just not going to work because it's 5 acres. That's an easy one. What I ask from people is to look through that list and say, or you may know this now and say, hey, Jeremy, Oak Point, this is something that we think really needs to rise to the top of consideration on a site matrix. Because certainly everybody has different things that they think about and needs for their family or their community or travel or whatever. That would help us kind of prioritize or move things up into the first box. Is there anything that people, whether you're online, raise your hand, and we can let you in, or people here that would say, this is what's important. Joe, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be great. Joe, do you have a question on Zoom? Okay. Anybody in the audience? We nailed it the first time. Mike?
Jeremy, you might want to point out, maybe you did, and I missed it, but the fact that the state is only going to fund one school, it could be wings to a school, but they're not going to fund a new Fairfield and a new 2 separate schools. Going to have to be one building and interconnected. And so if we do just the young school, you got a lot of money into this, a lot of money into the young, and so you've got this subgroup that's working on all those different possibilities. That's kind of an important part. That's the way the state has it. There's no way we're going to get 2 separate schools. Is that correct?
Yes, the current guidance is that the state is not going to come to our community and say, we're going to solve all of your current problems with the current setup and build you more than one school. So one of the things that, again, when we talk about what we hope to put out as a product from the programming and site selection is some options, meaning that if as a community, we select a replacement of young school, that we are very clear as a community, what are the other challenges that will be remaining? And I suspect there will be some conversations about equity. And so we have to be very focused on the decision that we make that's best and what it leaves the community with, because I think, as Rob said, for us to come back and expect that the state is going to do this again for us will probably be a long, long, long time from now. So this is our, and I've said this before, this is our bite at the apple. As a community, we have to determine what the right bite is. Do you swallow the whole apple? Do you take a nibble of it? Or do you make something that we think can work and that we can handle moving forward? That make sense to you, Mike, of how we? Mike?
The other way. Yeah, a couple questions about this matrix. The public water available, 3-phase power, public sewer is here as a top priority. I was under the impression the state might help us with those connections if the site didn't connect already. Is that the case?
Possibly. I know that they gave an example at one point is that depending on the site. Let's say that you, I guess the example is, let's say you have a large site that you use. And that there could be a connection, but as a community, you decided to place it 3,000 yards when it could be 150 yards. They might negotiate some of that with you. They might not do it all. They might do some. So I think that's a piece, Mike, that comes into is that, is it within I want to say within reason, within acceptable, does it? If we chose a site that was 7 to 10 miles away from public water and sewer, I do not think that the state is going to run 7 to 10 miles worth of public sewer for the city of Saco.
It may not be critical that the power is already on the site, but that it's proximal and available.
I think it needs to be within reason for us to give to wherever that may be, that you give a good, that you have the ability and that you can present a solid case of why.
I also see at the very bottom, there's a no local land that is required owned by a city, one of the criteria is. I know you also mentioned the state might purchase land that's not owned by the city. So I'm wondering how that factor is in, how to please that.
So there are two different pieces that can happen is yes, they will acquire land for you. It may go back into, you may have someone who's asking X for a amount of property, which after 2 appraisals may be much higher than what the state will give you. I think it also goes back to that piece of that Rob talked about is that there may be this wonderful 45-acre lot that you say, hey, that's great for us. It leaves us room for expansion. It is, perfectly flat. It is X, Y, and Z. And the state says, we're going to give you, you only need 28 of those 45 acres. And so that's where it comes back into, does the city municipality want to make up that difference? Or is there something that you already own that they're not going to buy from you? They're not going to buy something you already own. And because that's a better decision long-term for the city.
Jeremy, are you going to go over any kind of timeline? Maybe I missed that, but I didn't see. I don't know. Important to mention that this is probably going to take 5 or 6 years to complete.
So I think on the long end, 5 to 6 years is a possibility. I think that when we look at the current timeline we have now, and I would have Rob come up and talk more about this. We know that there is a date that we need to get out to voters. Because at the end of this, even though it's a project, we have to go to the voters. And again, I would be excited about making sure that we can move this project as soon as possible, because I think Saco has waited for some time on this. And initially, our goal would be looking at not this November, but working really hard to see if next November makes a lot of sense. And I think that we are positioned to possibly meet that goal with a lot of work and a lot of meetings, because the big date for us as a community is when we get to go to the ballot and say yes or no on this.
Can you explain, like, even with state funding, the city still has to bond 100% of the project up front, right? Can you explain?
We'll let Rob explain that because I might not get it 100% right, but you are going to take a bond anticipation note at first.
Yes, you're going to do the bond anticipation note to pay the initial bills, but then when the bond does happen, the city does do the bond, and the bond payments are reimbursed by the state. That makes sense. So yes, the city is responsible for the bond, but the state pays you back. So, annually, not at the end.
So I could, just so that you could see what that looks like, because in Biddeford, we have a state, the Biddeford Middle School was a state approved project. So once it takes that bond out, that money for the bond will come in on page 4, I believe it is, of your ED 279, which is your state funding, and it will be for your bond payment will come in your state subsidy. So one of the things that will show is you'll show a large debt service on your 11 lines in the subsidy piece. And then somebody who's, when you're looking around and those state numbers come out of, well, how much did this community get up or down in state subsidy? You'll see this massive spike in Saco of saying, okay, we just went from getting $16 million in state subsidy to 21 million, and everyone around is going to say, well, how did that happen? And you're going to say, because of the state approved project, they funnel that through the subsidy system, and it sits there on page 4.
I didn't know about page 4. Thank you. So this I kind of glazed over this very quickly and stopped at the site approval. So we have the straw poll at the end of the process for site approval. At that point, you're going to want, in order to get site approval, you have to know what the program's going to be. You have to know if it's going to be a K-2 school or pre-K to 5 school or someplace in between. So you're going to go through a whole process to get to that. And one of the reasons that the time, and I'm kind of getting around to Mike's question, the time takes a while to get there, is it's going to take a while for the community to decide that this is the right site school. You're going to have some people want to have a small school, some people want a big school, whatever it is, there's got to be a rationale to get there. And then we support that to the state. Concept approval is when we actually have a concept design, a site design at the concept level for the school process. So we will have collectively decided how big the school is going to be before we get to concept. So we'll know what size site it's going to be to support the building, but that's going to be the really critical piece of site. The site approval process can take 1.5 years because you have to go through all those iterations and deciding what direction to go and then actually getting there. Concept approval takes a little bit less time. And at the end of we do the specs, we do the program conference with the state to make sure that they agree with it, talking about the concept itself, having a concept review with the state. And then there's another straw poll. So we'll come back here or some other building and have the presentation to you folks of the concept for the school itself. And there'll be a straw poll again. And it's both of these are non-binding straw polls. But after you've done that, you come back to the voters at a local referendum. So that's when you actually decide to spend X amount of dollars on the project, and the state needs to have that positive vote to move forward so that they can support the project going forward. So that's the critical part from a money standpoint. Nothing is decided about the cost of the school until you get to that part. That's a very critical piece. And so the referendum, as Jeremy was saying, is hopefully 1 year from now. It could be a little bit longer. You know, if everybody agrees on we want to do this tomorrow, then it can be short. But it's unlikely that that's going to happen. We've gone to schools where we've got 8 different towns with their own little elementary schools, and the townspeople love the idea of it until they realize that they could take care of the needs of all these different towns in a couple of schools or modification of those schools. In one school, it was an elementary school process for one town. We ended up building a middle high school for all 8 towns and took care of the needs in different ways than you could ever imagine at this point. So that's why this process is so important. But that's where you decide to spend the money, and the state goes forward with it. And then you get the design, which takes about a year, depending on the size of the school. If it's just a replacement for a school, it might go a little bit shorter. If it's a bigger school, it might take a little bit longer, and you need to go through permitting and all those things. So that takes a while. It's not just the design aspect. And then the construction is going to take a couple of years. So that's why Jeremy's saying it's 5 to 6 years. It might be 5 to 6 years starting November last year, if everything goes very smoothly, but it's more likely that it's going to be 5 years from now. That's a good question, Mike.
I just want to get that out there.
Okay, good, thanks. I knew you knew, but thank you for asking the question. Other questions? I don't know about you, but I tend to get a little drowsy with some of these on after a while. And not speak quite as well. I mumble anyways, but with this on, hopefully you've heard what I've had to say. We all heard Jeremy.
Rob, another question that I just want us to be able to talk about is, we talked about there are some things depending upon the size of the school that you build or the grade level that you build that may or may not be paid for by the state. Could you provide us some examples of that?
Sure. Well, the one I said mentioned before was the site. That would be in Monmouth, that we end up buying more land because the community wanted to do that. We had a school that there was, this is probably 8 years ago. They wanted it to be more sustainable from an energy standpoint. And so, we bumped up the mechanical systems. We had a rooftop collection system where you could use the water for flushing the toilets. We had put signs over all the toilets to not drink the water afterwards. But it was including the kindergarten where they couldn't read yet. So there was that, and they wanted to do upgrades for athletics for the community, not just the school we were doing. So they put money into that. And then there was some size issues where they wanted to have a bigger gym. So the different, the state paid for $50 million, and the community paid for $4.5 million. So it's typically, you can do a school where there's little or no state funding. The Monmouth school is one that was completely state funding, except for that one little piece of property on what was the budget on the total project budget, Norm?
It's about 25 million.
About 25 million. It was a pre-K to 8 for a small community. So the land acquisition, I think, was like $45,000. So it was a pretty minor amount for the local folks to take care of. We've had some where the local folks kicked in an extra 10 million on a $60 million project. So it's a matter of what's important to you folks. And if we make the argument for an auditorium and it's important to everybody and it falls on deaf ears, then we'll talk about that too.
Did Bedford throw in any money for the middle school over Bedford?
Yes.
Yes. A lot.
Yep. Some of the, I think they upgraded the auditorium. There were some size pieces that needed to go. And again, I wasn't there for all of that. I've just kind of been watching the bills. I was a principal in Westbrook when Westbrook Middle School was on the state construction list. And in Westbrook, they had a local vote for the auditorium, that additional space. Sometimes you'll see a community say, you know what, we're concerned about the future and we want to have 5 or 6 more classrooms. That could happen. We want to plan well for the future, and that would be a decision that locally you would pick up. So they picked up some. Sanford, who would be probably the closest project that we've seen in the area that is with state construction, they picked up some pieces on their own. A lot of it was upgraded auditorium, and I think they had the Sanford High School piece. I think if my memory serves, it was over $100 million, and locally they picked up like 8.
It was more than 10.
More than 10?
I think it's more than 10.
Okay.
We didn't do that project, but we hear stories.
So those will be all community decisions of, depending on the school, what they would pay for. You know, I think the example would be is that, you know, field, if you build a K2 school, a K2 school, they're not putting a turf football field in for you. You know, probably not gonna get a baseball field either. But you might get some play spaces.
You know, that's actually a great lead in. So we did do the Falmouth Elementary School, and we were hired to do a small school, but it was in an area that did not improve the traffic. And so somebody, one of the select people at public forum suggested, why don't we put it on top of the stadium field at the high school? And everybody thought that was kind of silly until you started thinking about it. And it was the best place for their community. And they built a school between the middle school and the high school on top of what was the stadium field because it needed a ton of work. The state paid for a new stadium field right next door, track, field, everything. They didn't pay for the turf. So that was an upgrade by the community, but they did get a nice, beautiful stadium for football and lacrosse and whatever. And we also got another ball field because we were displacing another ball field. So things that have to be displaced might be picked up as long as you have a good reason for doing it.
I'll take some questions.
Sure. I asked once before, but I'd love to. Any other questions?
Not a question,
Yes.
just a comment back on the matrix,
Yes.
the primary site selection. Just a quick thought, I went through some of these, the fiber optic service availability. As we look at this, and it's not even built for 5 years in the future, and we're looking at a 40-year investment. Perhaps that could be moved up with some sort of technology piece, ensuring that there's flexibility wherever that site's selected, whether that be like 5G or fiber optic. And then also just in terms of the walking and biking access, and as we look at the type of facility that we're going to be building, ensuring that there is ADA compliant sidewalks, bicycle access, so that the community can get there in a different way other than bus.
Having said that, I think in Kennybunk, they wanted the state to pay for sidewalks between the two schools that have been built. They would do the sidewalks to a certain level, but not to the other one. So that's where another community kicked in some differential. So there's lots of different things. I know that's not part of your question, but that was one way to it would take care of the safety issues, not just the compatibility with the other school. The state does pay for a reasonable technology package. They don't want to spend a lot of money on iPads that are gone in 5 years when paying bill for 20. But the infrastructure is built in, is paid for by the project. Something like that. Sorry.
So we find a piece of property that already has a building on it. Will the state pay for the demolition of that building?
Yes. Within reason, all this stuff is within reason, but if it's a building, then this should be demolished to put something on it. It makes sense, yes. We've taken down older schools after the fact that because we need to put down, we put the school down on a field, and then to make the new field, we demolished the old school to put the new fields in. And in that case, it made sense. The state did pay for it. Yes.
And will they have standards for like a car line, buses and parking, not just parking for the staff, but so that parents can actually park at the school?
Yes, they have short definitions of how much parental parking they'll pay for staff. Remember what the actual amount of parking they'll pay for parents?
Well, typically it's for parents, it's like, depending on the size of the school, usually around 15 to 20 visitor spots. And then for staff parking, it's usually one parking space per full-time equivalent staff person. But they have you compare that against what the zoning ordinance requires for the particular city. So there's a little bit of negotiation that happens there. It's not a ton of parent parking.
They do pay for queuing. Going back to the Falmouth project, they had terrible traffic problems coming to the middle school and elementary and the high school. We had a new school and everybody's nervous about that. We were able to change the queuing for all three schools within this project and took care of a lot of the traffic problems for the other two schools at the same time. So safety is paramount to the state process.
That also lead to the parking, different. Is that something the parking component to the city as well? I put 2,900 plus there, so the parking there, which is wonderful for parents, students,
I don't know the answer to that.
I would say likely.
Yeah, I mean, again, you think about that parking lot over there and you go there during the middle of the day, it's pretty full with just staff alone. But there are certainly some pieces out back. And I think, again, some of it's about your site too. When you think about that site there where they located the school in between two buildings, and had a pack there, you needed that. You needed some overflow from the other buildings, parking. So that was all wrapped in. I don't remember what happened, and I will ask the question, what happened in Westbrook, because I think there were some conversations about that upper lot that may have been paid for locally. But I'll call the former superintendent and ask that.
The state keeps their kind of a baseline.
Yes. Yeah. And the same thing with the square footage of the building. Now that we're talking site now, but the square footage of the building is there's a baseline for how many square feet per student for different age groups. And how big the classrooms, as Sarah mentioned, 800,000 depending on the age group. But the size of the cafeteria, the gym, all the things within the school, there's a formula you're supposed to follow. We'll be telling you what all that is as we go through the process. And you can decide if that's enough.
One thing that, from the site standpoint, that is something that's worth mentioning is that a lot of older schools like at Fairfield or Young, they were built in the 1950s or 60s. So you're used to having buses dropping off where parents are driving in and everything's kind of happening in one area. One of the things that the state requires is that you have a completely different bus drop-off area from a parent drop-off area in parking areas. So you end up with a lot more site footprint that then gives you a little bit of flexibility for like after hours. If you have a school function and you allow people to say park in a bus loop during a school function, it gives you a little bit more flex than you might if you were trying to kind of overlap some of those circulation elements the state really discourages you from doing.
That's great. Yes.
At the time of the community referendum, where they're saying yes or no to a certain number, do we know at that point how much the state is going to cover of the project?
Yes. Yeah. It'll be very clear. And the referendum will also include if there are things that the community, through these processes and through the committees, want to add. So that if it's X amount of millions of dollars, and it's an extra million for local, you'll see what that piece is. And all the things that are included.
Rob, am I correct that those are separate questions?
They can be, but they don't need to be. Sometimes the community feels so strongly they want to tie together, and sometimes it's a totally separate question. Yes.
Will the state cover air conditioning?
No. Because the state will pay for air conditioning in the library, computer rooms.
The main,
The main-
I'm sorry.
The administrative spaces, and also we can extend it sometimes into special ed areas that are used during the summer.
Okay, but if we want it for every state like.
Right, that would be a local
Locally
expense.
funded.
You can pay for the differential.
You know, with the way things are going now with climate problems and stuff and us using the buildings more and more in the summer, you don't think that that would ever, change in the near future?
Ever and near are two different things.
Yeah.
So. but-
Not for this project.
We doubt it would be for this project, but the state is revising some of their stances on things based on what we just went through for the last year and a half. Not necessarily air conditioning, but on they've always been very strong on ventilation. Some of the new schools that we've designed all have better building envelopes, so they're easier to heat and less costly to heat. We put in better windows and proper locations, so there's less glare. So a lot of the schools have less need for air conditioning because we ventilate them well and we put the windows in the right place and we provide daylight harvesting and good shading when you need it. So they're not as bad as some of these older schools that are really hot on one side and really cold on the other. Good ventilation and distribution. So they are better, but if you want to have air conditioning right now, they'll pay for the ventilation component of the system, but the air conditioning part is so you get probably like 2/3 of the cost of air conditioning.
And my response to that is that somebody always has to be first. And I would say, quote, Kurt Schilling, why not us? I mean,
Yeah, no.
we have to talk about this project, about the why and why it's important here and be able to present that to the state because things do change. And I would say that, while Westbrook did not get all of the geothermal paid for in that project, there is a clear advantage. We can all talk about geothermal and the challenges there. But there is a clear advantage of having temperature controlled rooms in a project. Biddeford High School did not put air conditioning in. And the front side of that high school is all glass. And there are days in the high school that you can walk up and see 95 degrees.
We didn't do that.
So I do think that, Jess, I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Because one of the things that we learn about in a project is the schools really don't shut down. We have summer break, but there is summer school, there is parks and recs, there are theater camps that go on in the summertime. There are many different things that continue to happen. And there could be a great argument made for why climate control is important in this building when you think of all of the other components that are necessary in the school and for the city moving forward.
I think you would be the first that the state funded air conditioning for this whole school. You would not be the first that asked for it. There'd be lots of really good arguments for it.
Well, even if it was 5 or 6 years from now, and maybe hopefully not, but like, for example, now the kids in early spring, we could have what are called peak days in the schools. The kids can't be there because it's too hot with their masks. So I mean, maybe that could be.
We'll take every argument you guys will take about it. We truly will. We work for you folks. Eventually, we get paid through you by the state, but we work for you folks. There's an awful lot of things that as we've brought them to the table that the state pushed back on. And simple things like types of lighting fixtures, sunshade, that sort of thing. That are standards. Air conditioners are one of them, but we'll keep asking. Must have at least one. They've been great questions, just.
What kind of impact that, in your experience, does the new school provide financially savings wise?
We think it's significant, because if you take For instance, the 8 schools and the small communities, they had already closed a few of them. But just taking schools that had terrible thermal breaks within their walls and the windows, and you're replacing them with a new school that has, we're up to our 30 now on the walls. 20 is what we've been going with, but that's starting to bump up even more. And at least our 30 in the roofs and tighter air, tighter controls for air infiltration. So you're gonna have a lot less energy usage. So big projects to be significant. Yes.
Is it a state standard or a community decision that there are separated art, music, library classrooms? They're not shared.
That's a state decision. The state has, like, when you go do a state project, those are all separate spaces. So an art room, a music room, separate gymnasium from cafeteria, you don't have any of those shared spaces anymore. They're all identified as individual spaces.
Unless you really want them all in the same place.
No.
You can ask for that.
No.
Going back to the state standards, the state standards are extremely reasonable. I mean, they push back on certain things that we'll talk about later times, but most of the things that you would think are standard, we'll go in and interview staff in a school, and sometimes the staff members will just say, well, what would you really like? I said, I'd really like a couple more outlets, because in some of these little schools, they're like 2 outlets. Also, it's all going to be code. You're going to have outlets everywhere. So we're not going to be building a Taj Mahal, but we're going to be building a really nice facility. And the program element goes back to an earlier other piece of there where we have the educational specifications, which are going to be drawn up by the community. We're not allowed to do it. The state's not going to do it for you. You have to do your educational specifications, which tells the state what your programs are and why, and what the buy-in is from the staff and the community. And I'm not sure who that's going to be. We'll be talking about that the next year, but somebody locally is going to have to do the educational specifications. We take that to a program conference based on that. We say, the ed specs call for all these things that we really need. The ed specs are probably called for air conditioning because you really want to get that. But we'll negotiate all the stuff in the educational specifications. It shows that this is how we're going to meet the needs of the community. It's not just the way you have a program now. You've got, if you do combine 2 schools or 3 schools, or whatever it is, it's going to be different than if you just had the 1 school. So some of the opportunities educationally might be things you haven't thought about yet because they're all together, or even if it's just in the same community school that you're going to have, you're going to change how you do things because you're going to have more space. The young school that's going away, so that's something that's clear. The young school is energy efficient because it's too small. You don't have enough space to do all the stuff you're supposed to do. If it's half the space, it's using half the energy. Well, it's affordable, but it's done. So think about what you really want to have in your school and what the opportunities are if you want to combine or if you don't.
Okay,
Sounds good.
so
If you get home and you say, oh, I wish I would have asked that, please email so that we can add that. We really want to keep a great list of frequently asked questions. Like, I know Meg was taking notes. Will they pay for air conditioning? That would be something that we would want to add to our frequently asked questions. We'll be spinning up a piece on our website, but all school construction stuff, so people can click on it. On all the agendas, I tried to put some of that timeline piece and part of the process and looking at the matrix. If you have some thoughts about the matrix, the site selection committee will want to do that piece. And over the next couple of months, I'm sure there'll be a second one of these. I think we're going to try to whether it's here or get to visit one of our other schools. I think it's important that we ask people to come into our schools so that you at least get a quick look-see around of some of the facilities that we have. And it's always great to get the community out into some of the different buildings. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Have a great evening, what's left of it, and cheer for the Red Sox.